This is the real Frank Zappa book by Frank Zappa, as read by Fake Zappa, and sponsored by the Ocean Spray Beverage Corporation, starting in Chapter 4, page 65. Are we having a good time yet? During the early days, when Paul Buff still owned the studio, I met Ray Collins. Ray had sung with a number of R&B groups since the mid-50s and had recorded with Little Julian Herrera and the Tigers. In 1964, he was supporting himself by working as a carpenter, and on weekends he sang with a group called the Soul Giants at a bar in Pomona called the Broadside. Apparently, he got into a fight with their guitar player. Ray Hunt punched him out, and the guitar player quit. They needed a substitute, so I filled in for the weekend. The Soul Giants were a pretty decent bar band. I especially liked Jimmy Carl Black, the drummer, a Cherokee Indian from Texas with an almost unnatural interest in beer. His style reminded me of the guy with the great back seat of the old Jimmy Reed records. Roy Estrada, who was a Mexican American and also had been part of the Los Angeles R&B scene since the 50s, was the bass player. Davey Coronado was the leader and saxophone player of the band. I played the gig for a while, and one night I suggested that we start doing original material so we could get a record contract. Davey didn't like the idea. He was worried that if we played original material, we get fired from all the nice bars we were working in. The only things club owners wanted bands to play were Wooly Bully, Louie Louie, and In the Midnight Hour, because if the band played anything original, nobody would dance to it. When they wouldn't dance, they don't drink. The other guys in the band liked my idea about a record contract and wanted to try original stuff. Davey departed. It turned out that Davey was absolutely right. We couldn't keep a job anyplace. One of those places we got fired to was the Tomcat A Go-Go in Torrance. During this period in American musical history, anything with go-go pasted at the end of it was really hot. All you were required to do, if you were a musician desiring steady work, was to grind your way through 5 sets per night of loud rhythm tracks, while girls with fringed costumes did the twist, and if that particular body movement summed up the aesthetic of the serious beer drinker. The groups that got most of the work were the ones who pretended to be English. Often they were surf bands who wore wigs so they looked like they had long hair, or added the word Beatles somewhere in their band name. You get the drift. Beatle clone groups were all over the place. We didn't have long hair. We didn't have band uniforms. And we were ugly as fuck. We were, in the biblical sense of the word, unemployable. A converted shoe store in Norwalk with a beer license also fired us. Of course, the gig didn't pay that well. $15 per night divided by 4 guys. There was no bandstand, so we were asked to play in the corner, surrounded by tables upon which 3 middle-aged women, the pride of Norwalk, perhaps relatives of the owner, wearing dark tan pantyhose to hide what I managed to be Roquefort cheese molded into the shape of human legs, dangled their putrid fringe in their faces while we played, that's right, you guessed it, Louie Louie. How we got our first manager. Page 67. While I was living in the bungalow where my stomach almost exploded, 1964, I ran into John Chaveris again. On that occasion, Don introduced me to a friend of his named Mark Chika, a, quote, pop artist, end quote, from New York's East Village. Mark was about 50 and wore a beret. He was living in West Hollywood with a waitress from Ash Grove named Stephanie, who was also sort of beatnik looking. The main focus of his work was a group of large paintings that looked like police department pistol targets designed to be viewed under flashing lights, which gave the illusion that the silhouettes were jumping around. I found this a little baffling, but what the fuck do I know from art? We hung out and had some laughs in spite of the targets. I had come to the conclusion that the band needed a manager, and I thought, oh, I was going to regret this one, that the person required for this important position needed to be someone with an artistic background. Only then, I reasoned, would our aesthetic be properly misunderstood, and once we had acquired a manager of such sensitivity, our future success in show business would be assured. So I convinced Mark to take the mysterious voyage out of Pomona, 50 miles east, where he might listen to the Mothers live at the Broadside. What did I know from managing? I told him that if he wanted to manage the group and get us some gigs, to go ahead. He didn't really know how to do that. What did he know from managing? He brought in a guy named Herb Cohen, who was managing some folk and folk rock groups and was looking for another act to pick up. Eventually, they became joint managers of our band, with a contract negotiated on behalf of the group by Herb's brother, an attorney named Martin Mutt Cohen. Suddenly we had a real Hollywood manager, an industrial professional who had actually been booking groups into real Hollywood nightclubs for years and would presumably do the same for us. After being forced at great expense into the Musicians' Union, Local 47, we started to pick up slightly better paychecks. However, our new, slightly skilled management team was taking 15% off the top. Almost overnight, we had jumped from starvation level to poverty level. The early freak scene in LA. On Mother's Day, 1964, the name of the band was officially changed to The Mothers. We had begun to build a little continuity on the psychedelic dungeon circuit. There was a scene evolving in LA at the time, something very different from the scene in San Francisco. San Francisco in the mid-60s was very chauvinistic and ethnocentric. To the Friscoids' way of thinking, everything that came from their town was really important art, or anything from any place else, especially LA, was dog shit. Rolling Stone magazine helped to promote this fiction nationwide. One of the reasons musicians moved to San Francisco was to be certified as part of the real deal. The other was the Kool-Aid bonus at the Grateful Dead concerts. The scene in Los Angeles was far more bizarre. No matter how peace love the San Francisco bands might try to make themselves, they eventually had to come south to the evil old Hollywood to get a record deal. My reconciliation, my recollection is that the highest cash advance paid for signing any group during that time was for the Jefferson Airplane, an astounding, staggering $25,000, an unheard of sum of money. The Byrds were the be-all and the end-all of Los Angeles rock then. They were it. And then a group called Love was it. There were a few, quote, psychedelic, end quote, groups that never really got into be it. But they could still find work and get record deals, including the West Coast pop art experimental band, Sky Saxon and the Seeds, and the Leaves, noted for their cover version of Hey Joe. When we first went to San Francisco in the early days of the Family Dog, it seemed that everybody was wearing the same costume, a mixture of Barbary Coast and the Old West, guys with handlebar mustaches, girls in big bustle dresses with feathers in their hair, etc. By contrast, the LA costumery was far more random and outlandish. Musically, the northern bands had a little more country style. In LA, it was folk rock to death. Everything had that fucking D chord down at the bottom of the neck where you wiggle your finger around like needles and pins. The blues was acceptable in San Francisco, but didn't go over in Hollywood at all. I remember the Butterfield Blues Band playing at the Trip. They were hot shit every place else in the country, but people in LA would rather have listened to Mr. Tambourine Man. Just plain folks. I had seen Lenny Bruce a number of times at Cantor's Deli, where he used to sit in front of in a front booth with Phil Spector and eat knockwurst. I didn't really talk to him until we opened for him at the Fillmore West in 1966. I met him in the lobby between seats and asked him to sign my draft card. He said no. He didn't want to touch it. At that time, Lenny lived with a guy named John Jundich. John earned his living part-time by renting PA systems to local groups. A state-of-the-art system that then consisted of two Altec A7 cabinets powered by a 200-watt amplifier and no monitor system. They hadn't invented it yet. The old-school audio wizards had convinced everyone that it was impossible to put a microphone that close to any speaker. Vocalists had no way to hear what they were singing. They could only hear their voices bouncing off the back wall from the main PA. We use Judnich's system to perform in the Shrine Exposition Hall, about 5,000 seats. Anyway, John used to visit every once in a while, and it was on one of these occasions that he introduced us to Crazy Jerry. Jerry was about 35 or 40, and had been in and out of mental institutions for years. He was addicted to speed. When he was a young boy, his mother, who worked for the probation department, presented him with a copy of Gray's Anatomy. He read it dutifully and noted that in some of the illustrations of the muscles it said, such and such a muscle when present, and so it was that Jerry set out to develop the when present muscles of the human body. He invented exercise devices for those special areas that had not been inhibited by muscle tissue since the book was written. He didn't look like a bodybuilder, but he was very strong. He could bend rebars, the steel rods used to reinforce concrete, by placing them on the back of his neck and pulling forward with his arms. As a result of this personal experimentation, he had sprouted weird lumps all over his body, but that was just the beginning. Somewhere along the line, Jerry discovered that he loved, maybe even addicted to, electricity. He loved getting shocked and had been arrested a number of times when unsuspecting suburbanities had discovered him in their yards. Suburbanites had discovered him in their yards with his head pressed against the electric meter because he just wanted to be near it. He and a friend once jumped over a fence of the Nicholas Canyon Power Substation for the same reason. The friend nearly died from electrocution. Jerry escaped. He lived for a while in Echo Park with a guy named Wild Bill the Mannequin Fucker in a house filled with store mannequins. Wild Bill was a chemist who made speed. Jerry used to carry equipment and ingredients up the step hill to the lab in exchange for lodging and free drugs. Wild Bill had a hobby. The mannequins in the house had been painted and fitted with rubber prosthetic devices so he could fuck them. On festive occasions, he would invite people to come over to fuck his family, including a little girl mannequin named Caroline Cuntley. Dad, Mom, Junior, Caroline Cuntley. Jerry wanted to be a musician, so he taught himself to play the piano by using a mirror. He told me that by watching his hands in the mirror placed just so, it made the distance between the keys look smaller, and it was a lot easier to learn that way. He also wore a metal hat, an inverted colander, because he was afraid that people were trying to read his mind. One morning, my wife Gail and I woke up to find Crazy Jerry hanging by his knees like a bat from the branch of a tree in our backyard, right outside the bedroom window. Later that night, in our basement, I made a recording of his life story. He didn't have any teeth, so I found it hard for him to talk. But in the course of a few hours, we learned that once, when he was in the institution, they were shooting him full of Thorazine. He was able to jump a 12-foot fence and get away from the guards. Page 72. He went to his mother's house to hide out. The house was locked, so he crawled in under the house and came up in the kitchen through the bread drawer. He got in bed and went to sleep. His mother, the probation officer, came home, found him, and turned him in again. Compared to Jerry and Bill, Lenny Bruce was quite normal. At that time, according to Judnich, Lenny used to stay up all night dressed in a doctor's outfit, listening to Sousa marches, working on his legal briefs. It was sort of colorful in Southern California in those days. But a couple of the Republican administrations and poof! Duke of what? And if I'm elected, In 1965, there were only 3 clubs in Hollywood that meant anything in terms of being seen by a record company, and all of them owned by the same ethnic organization. One was called The Action, one was called The Trip, and the other one was the Whiskey A Go Go. The Action was a place where actors and television personalities went to hang out with hookers. The Whiskey was the permanent residence of Johnny Rivers, who played there for years, and the Trip was the big show place where all the recording acts played when they came to town. Donovan, the Butterfield Blues Band, Sam the Sham, and the Pharaohs, bands like that all played there. There were a few other clubs in town, but they didn't have the same status in those places. A new group coming to work on the circuit would start at the Action, then maybe on Johnny Rivers' day off they could play at the Whiskey, but they wouldn't get their name on the marquee, which would still say Johnny Rivers. And if they got a record contract, they got to play in the Trip. They eventually landed a job in the Action. On Hollywood Night, 1965, during the break before the last set, I was sitting on the steps in front of the place, wearing khaki work pants, no shoes, an 1890s bathing suit, and a black Homburg hat with the top pushed up. John Wayne arrived in a tux with 2 bodyguards, another guy, and 2 ladies in evening gowns, all very drunk. Reaching the steps, he grabbed me, picked me up, and started slapping me on the back, shouting, "I saw you in Egypt and you were great, and then you blew me." I took an immediate dislike to the guy. Remember, all kinds of show people went to this club, from Warren Beatty to Soupy Sales, so it wasn't unusual for someone like the Duke to show up. The place was packed. When I got up on stage and began the last set, I announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, it's Halloween. We were going to have some important guests here tonight, and we were expecting George Lincoln Rockwell, the head of the American Nazi Party. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it, but here's John Wayne." Soon after I said that, he got up from his table, stumbled onto the dance floor, and started to make a speech. I leaned the microphone down so everyone could hear it, something along the lines of, "And if I'm elected, I promise to..." At that point, one of his bodyguards grabbed him and made him sit down. The other one handed the microphone back to me and told me to cool it, or there was going to be big trouble. At the end of the show, the manager of the club came over to me and said, "Be nice to the Duke, because when he gets like this, he starts throwing $50 bills around." Page 74. I had to pass his table on my way out. As I went by, he got up and smashed my hat down on top of my head. I took it off and popped it back out. This apparently annoyed him, as he shouted, "You don't like the way I fix hats? I've been fixing hats for 40 years. I had put it back on my head, and he smashed it down again. I said, "I'm not gonna give you a chance to apologize," and walked out. How we got our first record deal. Not long after that, Johnny Rivers went on tour, and we were hired to as a temporary replacement at the Whiskey A Go Go. By chance, Tom Wilson, a staff producer for MGM Records, was in town. He was up the street at the Trip, watching a big group Herb Cohen talked him into a quick visit to the whiskey. He walked in while we were playing our big boogie number, the only one we knew, totally unrepresentative of the rest of our material. He liked it and offered us a record deal, thinking he had acquired the ugliest looking white blues band in Southern California, and advance of $2,500. The average budget for an LP in those days was $6,000 to $8,000. Most albums consisted of the A and B sides of an artist hit single, plus 7 or 8 other filler tunes, just enough to satisfy the minimum contractual time per side, 15 minutes. The other industrial norm was that groups didn't really play their own instruments for the basic tracks on their albums. They'd arrive in a purple hazish condition, and play the song a few times, after which the producer or A&R man would tweeze it, and the studio musicians who had been standing by would learn the tweezed version of it and play it in tune and with a good beat. There was a whole bunch of session specialists who ghosted for the major acts. The Monkees were the classic example of these acts. We played all our own basic tracks on Freak Out, with studio musicians added only for orchestral color. Hungry Freaks. Wilson was based in New York and had gone back there after booking the dates for the sessions. We were broke. MGM didn't give us the advance right away. The money was supposed to come later. The producer of Run Home Slow, Tim Sullivan, still owed me some money for the film score. When I finally located him, he was working out of a building on Seward Street in Hollywood, Decca's old scoring stage. He didn't have any cash, but in lieu of payment, he let us use his place to rehearse in. We had the best rehearsal hall any band could ever want, but we were starving. We collected soda bottles and cashed them in, using the proceeds to buy white bread, bologna, and mayonnaise. Thanks, Jesse. Finally, on the day of the first session rolled around, about 3 in the afternoon, at a place called TTG Recorders, Sunset Boulevard at Highland Avenue, the MGM Records accounting representative was a stingy old guy named Jesse K. Jesse walked around with his hands behind his back, pacing the floor while we were recording, making sure nobody ran up any extra overtime costs by going beyond the 3 hours allotted for each session. During a break, I went into the control booth and told him, "Look, Jesse, we got a problem here. We would like to stay on schedule. We would like to get all this done in 3 hours. These glorious 3 hours that you've given us to make this record. But we don't have any money and we're all hungry. Could you lend me $10? There was a drive-in restaurant downstairs from the studio, and I figured $1965 would be enough to feed the whole band and get us through the session. Well, Jesse's reputation was such that if anybody had seen him lending money to a musician, he would have been ruined. He didn't say yes, and he didn't say no. I walked away figuring that was it. I wasn't going to ask him anymore. I went back into the studio and prepared for the next take. Jesse walked in. He had his hands behind his back. He came over, casually pretended to shake hands with me. There was a $10 bill rolled up in his palm. He tried to pass it to me, except I didn't realize what was going on, and the money fell on the floor. He made a face like, "Oh shit!" and grabbed it up real fast, hoping that nobody had seen it, and stuffed it into my hand. Without this random act of kindness from Jesse, there might not have been a freak out album. Who are the Brain Police? Tom Wilson had returned to Los Angeles for the sessions. He was in the control booth and we began recording the first tune. Anyway, the wind blows. He was tapping his foot and nodding the way producers do in the movies. The second tune was, Who are the Brain Police? What would you do if you let us go home and the plastic's all melted and so is the chrome? Who are the Brain Police? What would you do when the labels come off and the plastic's all melted and the chrome is too soft? Who are the Brain Police? What would you do if the people you knew were the plastic that melted and the chromium too? Who are the Brain Police? From the album Freak Out 1966. I could see through the window that he was scrambling towards the phone to call his boss, probably saying, well, not exactly a white blues band, but sort of. Freak Out was a double album, and all the songs on it were about something. It wasn't as if we had a hit single and we needed to build some filler around it. Each tune had a function with an overall satirical concept. You're probably wondering why I'm here, and so am I, just as much as you wonder about me being in this place. That's just how much I marvel at the lameness at your face. You rise each day the same old way and join your friends out on the street, spray your hair and think you're neat. I think your life is incomplete, but maybe that's not for me to say. They only play me here to play. As the sessions continued, the more enthusiastic Tom Wilson became. About the middle of the week, I told him I would like to rent $1965 worth of percussion equipment for a session that starts at midnight on Friday, and I want to bring all the freaks from Sunset Boulevard in the studio and do something special. He agreed. We got the equipment and the freaks, and starting at midnight, recorded what turned out to be side 4 of the album. Wilson was on acid that night. I didn't know he had taken it. He told me later. I tried to imagine what he must have been thinking, sitting in the control room, listening to all that weird shit coming out of the speakers, and being responsible for telling the engineer, Amy Huddenary, who was not on acid, what to do.